Governor J.B. Pritzker is back home after a 3-day trade mission to Mexico, just as the Trump administration announces a sweeping new round of tariffs. So, what did he bring back? A message from Mexican businesses.
That the U.S. federal government must reestablish stability and consistency in the U.S.-Mexico relationship.
State-level trade negotiations in the era of Donald Trump. We'll talk about that on this edition of Capital Cast. Hello and welcome to Capital Cast. I'm Peter Hancock, and I'm here again this week with my colleague Ben Solinsky. Ben, thanks for being here.
Hello, Peter.
So I should note for listeners that we're recording this on Thursday afternoon, April 3rd. So by the time people listen to this, some things may have changed. But certainly one of the big stories in state government this week was Governor Pritzker's trade mission to Mexico, which wrapped up on Tuesday. Now, for those who may not know, this is something governors do. They don't carry out foreign policy per se, but they can engage in some significant hand-holding between Mexican and Illinois businesses, Mexican and Illinois state government officials, sort of acting as the state's salesman-in-chief, promoting Illinois as a good place to do business. Ben, what, if anything, did Governor Pritzker accomplish on this trip?
Yeah, I think the primary thing a lot of people are going to look for down the road are any new businesses coming to the state of Illinois, investing in Illinois via construction, establishing operations here, a manufacturing hub, for example. I think that's what a lot of people will ultimately grade this trip on as the years go by, is how are Mexican businesses investing in Illinois. But what he really accomplished in the short term is selling Illinois. The governor loves to call himself the chief marketing officer of the state of Illinois. He really believes that one of his primary jobs as governor is to talk about everything that the state has to offer, from logistical opportunities for the state, its location, natural resources. These are all things that he believes are really selling points for businesses and is going to help attract new talent and new investments to the state of Illinois. So he got an opportunity to show off all of that and to potentially down the line attract new businesses to Illinois.
But there were no specific new announcements of a Mexican business that's going to set up a plant in Illinois anywhere.
No, we heard from the governor that he did meet with a couple specific ones. He wouldn't say exactly who, but one was some sort of electrical provider that was looking at some operations here in Illinois. There was a retail business that is interested in establishing operations in Mexican-American communities. And obviously, we have a lot of communities that have a very high Latino and specifically Mexican population here in Illinois. So we know that those are some things that we might be able to watch for in the coming months and years from this trip.
Now, he did speak with the news media on a video chat from Mexico City Tuesday morning, and this was just hours before the Trump administration announced this new round of tariffs. But everyone on the call knew at the time that these tariffs were coming. They were clearly on people's minds. He was asked about that by several reporters, and let's listen to part of what he had to say.
Tariffs are really a tax on working families. They're not good for the economy, and these broad-based tariffs are very challenging and may lead, in fact, to a recession in the United States. Here in Mexico, there is deep concern. Let's start with just the concern that the tariffs seem so broad-based and not well negotiated or thought out that they will potentially destroy some businesses in Mexico that U.S. companies rely upon.
Okay, so clearly he's worried about the impact that these tariffs are going to have on international trade, particularly the trade that directly involves Illinois businesses. How much concern are you hearing about the long-term impact that these could have if they, in fact, stick around for a long time?
There's a lot of concern. I think, as the governor pointed out, that there's businesses in another country that want to invest in the United States, but they're really concerned about the stability. And I think there's a realization that, Donald Trump is president essentially for the next 4 years, and it's unlikely that his policies are going to completely go away. And he creates a lot of uncertainty naturally through his governing style. So I think that is playing a big factor here, in that people really aren't sure about investments that they should make in the United States, whether they're a foreign business that the governor is meeting with in Mexico, or even domestic businesses. The governor mentioned he believes there's automakers in Illinois that should be concerned for the long term by some of these tariffs that the president is implementing on certain goods. So I think there's a lot of worry, especially in the Democrat Party, obviously, that these tariffs are going to have a really negative effect on the economy. The governor referenced a recession. I think that's kind of where a lot of people's minds are at, especially as today on Thursday, we've seen the stock market really drop. People are worried that this is going to have really negative effects on the economy, not just here in Illinois, but around the country.
Okay, well, we'll be keeping an eye on that as the weeks progress to see whether or not it does have that kind of a long-term impact. In the meantime, there was other State House news this week. The Senate was in session here in Springfield. The House was not. We're coming up to the midpoint of the session. What issues do we see moving? Did anything actually move this past week?
Well, in the Senate here on Thursday, we've seen bills move forward. For the first time on the Senate floor, they passed more than 30 bills. Basically, I think all of them were unanimously approved and sent to the House. So nothing really huge has moved forward quite yet, but we are seeing some signs of some more controversial legislation, at least on the Senate side here, moving forward. Today, the Senate Executive Committee approved a bill that would create a referendum in the state in 2026, allowing voters to recall county elected officials. This is based on after the Sonia Massey shooting in Springfield, where a lot of Sangamon County voters wanted to recall Sangamon County Sheriff Jack Campbell.
Now, that was an incident where a sheriff's deputy, two deputies were called out to the house of a young African-American woman who appeared to be suffering from some psychiatric issues, and she was shot and killed in her own home by one of the deputies, who is now being charged with murder.
Right, and after that incident, there was a lot of outcry against Sheriff Jack Campbell. People were calling for him to resign, and the sheriff initially refused for a while. It actually got to a point where Governor Pritzker and some other top folks were also calling on Sheriff Campbell to resign. Eventually, the sheriff resigned, took a retirement, and that allowed the county board to find a new sheriff. So I think what a lot of voters in the county wanted was accomplished at the end of the day from that situation. But really, I think what Doris Turner is looking at here is that there was concerns that the county couldn't recall the sheriff despite voters wanting to do this. So this is going to put in legislation, give every county or every county outside of Cook County the ability to put a referendum on the ballot in 2026 where voters will decide if their county should get recall power or not.
Okay. And so next week, April 11th, is one of the big deadlines for the session. It's the deadline for each chamber to pass its bills and send them over to the other chamber. That really kind of marks the midpoint of the session. It's going to be a very busy week next week. Are there any major pieces of legislation that we're watching for next week, are we all just kind of still waiting for the budget issues to take shape?
Yeah, I think it's noteworthy to mention that there is not a lot of major issues right now intact that are moving through Springfield. There's lots of big issues like the budget. But a few small things I think we could potentially see next week are maybe some initiatives of Governor Pritzker that he proposed during his State of the State address. The cell phone ban is one thing that comes to mind that's seeming to get a lot of bipartisan support on both sides of the aisle. So we could be watching for that to move forward, which would create some new restrictions on schools where students would not be allowed to use cell phones in the classroom, but there's several exemptions that go along with that as well. Another bill that comes to mind is the Senate on Thursday, and the Senate Executive Committee discussed a bill regarding safe gun storage. This is a bit of controversial legislation, especially for gun owners, but it would impose some new regulations on how people should store their guns. So I think that's one of the bigger issues that we could be watching for. Gun bills are always popular in Springfield. And then Another one that's kind of a longer outstanding issue is there was a bill, it was one of the very first bills passed out of committee this entire spring. A Senate committee approved legislation that would make some changes to cannabis in vehicles. And this bill by Senator Rachel Ventura would basically end the requirement that cannabis be transported in an odor-proof container. There's been some kind of, if you're a layperson, some conflicting Supreme Court rulings from the state of Illinois on this, where if you have previously smoked marijuana in your car, but there's no cannabis in the car, that can't be probable cause. Burnt odor is not probable cause for a search.
Does the mere smell of cannabis or the mere odor of cannabis in a car suggest that cannabis is being smoked at that time, or is it maybe just lingering from some time a week or two ago?
And that's the question, because the court was looking at the question of burnt versus raw cannabis, because if it's burnt, that to the court was an indication that there may actually not be cannabis in the car. It could have been a lingering smell, as you mentioned, but the smell of raw cannabis, which police agencies say that they are trained in being able to detect the difference between these two, they say that that would be probable cause to search the vehicle because there is suspicion that a crime is being incurred, and that crime would be that the cannabis is not properly being transported in the vehicle because it's required to be in an odor-proof container. So if there's cannabis in a vehicle, in theory, you should not be able to smell it. So because of these rulings, Senator Ventura has come out with this proposal that would essentially get rid of it. There's several advocates who actually doubt that anything like an odor-proof container exists. So that's kind of one of the more interesting issues that we'll be watching. We've seen other states take this up. The General Assembly took this up a few years ago, but it didn't move forward very much either.
Okay, well, one of the other issues that we have talked about on this podcast is about the mass transit system in the Chicago area, which is facing a fiscal cliff. There was an extensive committee hearing that went late into the night earlier this week. Where do we stand on that? Are we expecting to see any movement on that before next week's deadline?
Certainly not before next week's deadline. Speaker Welch said back in the summer even he expects this to be a very last week of May issue, and it's very clearly shaping up to be this way if you're listening to any of these hearings on it. The Senate held a hearing on it earlier this week where basically the bottom line from senators was that the transit agencies, especially in the Chicago area, they need to make reforms to make riding public transportation safer. They need to improve their governing structure to cut down some costs and make those work more efficiently. And the lawmakers are really demanding that these things have to occur before they're going to give transit agencies even a dime to cover this more than $700 million gap that they're facing. So they're clearly a long way off. There's competing proposals out there about how to accomplish some of these reforms. I spoke to Senator Ron Villival this week, who is chairing the Senate Transportation Committee, and he said he is optimistic that there will be legislation before the end of session, but he also did make it pretty clear that the transit agencies need to play a bigger role in this and come up with more reforms themselves.
Okay, well, we will be watching for that, and we will be back next week to let you know what, if anything, actually did move during deadline week. In the meantime, we're going to wrap it up for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation with significant funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Until next time, this is Peter Hancock with Ben Solinsky on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team saying thank you for listening.